started, and I would like to welcome you all. Thank you for making time for the second STIAS public lecture. And as I said before, every semester we do have 3 public lectures, and we try to give a sense to everybody that joins us online the categories of fellows that we have at STIAS. So we usually try and ask the senior fellows, the humanities sciences, natural sciences, and also ask our young in quotes, young scholars, so that, so we are going to listen to one of our Isolomso fellow that will be introduced shortly. And I would like also in a special way to welcome colleagues that are online. I think there are quite a number of colleagues that joined online, and for their own purposes is just a very quick introduction that my name is Edward, Director STIAS, and I think probably that will justify why I'm standing here. We also want to bid farewell to Mikhail, who is leaving over the weekend. So for now, we bid you farewell. Where is he? He's packing his bags already. Wow. Yeah, I was going to say that we look forward to his contribution to safer diagnostics in the healthcare business. And we hope that we can share in the patterns that will come out of his work that he presented in his seminar. So the speaker will be introduced by Dr. Christoph Poe, our Senior Program Manager. And may I therefore invite Christoph to do the needful. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce the speaker today. Gibson was in the second cohort of Isolomso Fellows, so we were still early in the program and keen at the first cohort, the second cohort, yes, and really kind of exploring the possibilities that this fellowship program provides to young and early career and upcoming scholars from all over the continent. And I think he's proven us the concept for us. So Gibson is, as of this year, is a lecturer of French in the Department of Modern Foreign Languages at Stellenbosch University. He came to Stellenbosch from the University of Zimbabwe, where he lectured in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature. So that's also where Gibson earned his first degrees, his bachelor's and his second degree. And then he enrolled for a PhD at Stellenbosch University, supported by a scholarship from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Graduate School, which also at that point was starting up a program to provide scholarships to students from all over the continent. That was under a visionary program of a former rector of this university, Russell Botman, called the Hope Project, which involved several other universities in the continent under a program for one part called Pangia, of which Edward was also the chairperson for some time. So the lines cross. So he completed the PhD, Gibson completed the PhD in 2014, and then spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow in the department, the second of which was supported by the African Humanities Program of the ACLS, that's the American Council for Learned Societies. And it was on the basis of this work that Gibson eventually applied for the Isolomso Fellowship, and his application stood out. He spent 3 years, 3 residencies over, well, what eventually became 4 years thanks to the pandemic. 3 residencies, first in 2019 at STIAS, then a residency at the National Humanities Center in the US, which was in 2020, and it got him stuck there for some time thanks to the pandemic. But he used the time well. He came back to STIAS early this year for his final residency, and over the course of these residencies was able to more or less finish a manuscript titled Queer Bodies in African Films, which will, as soon as he's done the final revisions, be published under the African Humanities series with the publisher NISC. Now, in addition to working on the manuscript, Gibson has been publishing 8 publications over the course of the Isolomso Fellowship program in several well-recognized journals. He also received several awards. He was nominated the 2021 Mary Kingsley Zokonis Distinguished Lecturer by the African Studies Association of the UK and the Royal African Society, which among others provided him support to organize a panel at last week's African Studies Association of Africa conference, which was held at UCT. He was also awarded a virtual research fellowship at the Leeds University Centre for African Studies, or the Leeds Arts and Humanities Research Institute, I think, which was a virtual kind of a fellowship. And then he's been nominated to be the co-convener of the Queer African Studies Association, which is coordinate organization of the African Studies Association in the US, which is running for the period 2020 till 2022. So with all this, it's little wonder that Gibson was eventually recruited by his alma mater department last year. And as of March this year, he took up the new position at Stellenbosch University. And it's nice to have one of our fellows in the vicinity, in proximity. Gibson, we look forward not only to your talk today, but also to what your career holds in future as an Isolomso Fellow. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Christo, for that introduction, and thank you very much to everyone for making time to be here this afternoon. So my lecture this afternoon is based on the work that I've been doing during the Isolomso Fellowship for the past 3 or so years, and that study was entitled Queer Bodies in African Films. So what I'm going to try and do in the next 30 or so minutes is to try and summarize the main points of this project. So I sought to make 2 important interventions in the study, and the first was to focus on the body as a site of knowledge making in terms of queer lived experiences in Africa. The filmed queer bodies, I found out, are invested with multiple and often overlapping discourses. These bodies are inscribed with more than just desire, eroticism, and sexuality. They are disruptive figures whose materiality rethinks how gender and sexual identities are not just performed, but are also constructed and embodied. And the second important intervention which I sought to make was to bring into conversation North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, because I got the feeling that African studies has been and continues to be a very divided field, with the Sahara being the dividing line between these 2 bodies of scholarship normally and ways of thinking. I argue in this project that the linguistic, cultural, historic, and political differences that exist between North and Sub-Saharan Africa and gender-diverse specificities. These specificities should, however, not be a hindrance to our understanding of queer lived experiences in these different parts of the continent. Rather, thinking together with Kiguro Macharia, I show that the different films that I analyze often speak past, over, through each other, producing not a unified or unifying chorus, but dissonant voices that very so often come together in their shared quest for freedom. So for the purposes of this lecture, I've only selected 4 films from different parts of the continent, instead of going through all the films that I analyzed. So from the Maghreb, I'm going to analyze the film L'Amé du Salut, The Salvation Army by Moroccan author and filmmaker Abdel Attaya. And from Egypt, I'll look at the 2006 film, The Yakubian Building, directed by Marwan Ahmed. And from East Africa, the 2020 film, I'm Samuel, by Peter Murimi from Kenya. And then finally from South Africa, the 2007 film, The World Unseen, by Shamim Sarif. So these films offer a diversity of representations and also different languages and cultures. So the films are in Arabic, in English, in French, and Swahili, as well as Afrikaans. So I'll just move straight on to the first film, which is the film L'Armée du Salut, The Salvation Army. So this film is from the Maghreb, and one of the main themes that I found from the films from the Maghreb is that queer bodies from this part of Africa are silenced, they're mute, and they're also muted, which means they say very little on the screen. So given that these films say very little, I wanted to understand how to make sense of these lived realities if you have bodies which do not say anything or which say very little on the screen. So Abdel Attaya's film L'Armée du Salut, released in 2013, is an adaptation of his novel by the same name. The film details the life of a juvenile named Abdallah as he comes to terms with his sexuality within a very conservative Arab Muslim community in the early 1990s. The film is divided into two parts, with the first part detailing the life of the young protagonist in Morocco, and the second part moves to Switzerland, where the protagonist has moved to further his studies. So once he arrives in Switzerland, he doesn't get a very warm welcome as he had imagined, because the lover that he had, who was Swiss and was also a university professor, was not there to welcome him. So he found himself alone and homeless, having found out that the scholarship had not been processed as yet. So he finds temporary accommodation at a shelter run by the Salvation Army, from which the title of the film comes, L'Armée du Salut. So one of the striking elements of this film is the way in which dialogue is stripped down to its barest minimum. The film is composed of echoing silences in which focus is placed on the bodies and what they do, what they perform. The film opens with a sequence that lasts about 3 minutes, in which Abdallah sneaks into his older brother's bedroom, where he admires the latter's books and music cassettes. He eventually lays on his brother's bed, snugly caressing the pillow. So in this very static and silent scene, the camera is perfectly motionless as it focuses on the similarly static body of the protagonist, who is lost in savoring the minutest pleasures that he gets from the contact that he has with his brother's belongings, his bed, his pillow, and also his books. The silence and the shadowy ambience accentuate the unsayable and unrepresentable desire that the unflinching gaze of the camera is capturing. Making a space for himself within his brother's room, Abdallah probes the sensual potential of his body. In this coming-of-age film, the skin is a very important side of the protagonist's negotiation of his sexual identity. The skin functions in different ways. For example, through the skin, the young protagonist can experience different sensations and forms of intimacy. Through touch, he feels the different emotions which are considered wrong and incorrect in his society. However, what is important for Abdullah is that he's able to experience and legitimize these feelings and emotions. Moreover, the skin offers an important background or screen through which the silenced queerness is made visible. The skin allows the film to move what is deemed private into the public sphere. The filmic screen as a public sphere makes it possible to foster meaningful conversations on what it means to be gay in Morocco, and at the same time, what it implies to be gay and Arab as well as Muslim. I'll move on to the second film, which is from Egypt, and it's called the Yakubian Building, and as I said, it's directed by Marwan Ahmed. So one would think that films from Egypt would be very similar to those from the Maghreb because of their geographical proximity. However, this is not the case. So unlike the films from the Maghreb, where the queer characters are very silenced and muted, the characters from the films from Egypt speak. So this is a very interesting comparison of films from North Africa. So the Yakubian Building is a film adaptation again of a 2002 novel by the same title, written by Ala Al-Swani. The film focuses on the lives of inhabitants of a very luxurious apartment building in downtown Cairo. The building was erected in the 1930s, and the film itself is set in the 1990s at the time of the First Gulf War. The Yakubian Building, through its historical trajectory, embodies the changes that Egyptian society has undergone. A narrator recounts at the beginning of the film that when it was erected, the building had been inhabited by very rich and well-to-do people. However, the 1956 revolution saw many of these original tenants leave Egypt, and these were mainly foreigners and Jews. So these original inhabitants were replaced by soldiers. The building is also a space in which different bodies come into contact and in which different protagonists in the film experience and negotiate their sexuality. And for the purposes of this lecture, I'll focus on just two characters, Hatem Rashid and Abd Rabu. So of these two men, Hatem is the character that I would term queer. Abd, on the other hand, is simply a man who has sex with men for money, although he does not consider himself a sex worker. Hatem is a Franco-Egyptian man, and he owns a French language daily newspaper called Le Caire. And in the film, he has ephemeral homosexual encounters with different men who are normally poor and in need of money or different financial support. So one of these men is Abd, who is a poor and struggling police officer. So the first time that we see Hatem, he's within the boardroom of his newspaper, discussing what stories they could flight in their newspaper. So one of the journalists suggests that they do a story on homosexuality in Egypt. And based on the way the characters in that room look at him and also look at each other and giggle, it is very obvious that they're making fun of Hatem. So up until this point, nothing has been suggested about his own sexuality, though. This only comes into light in the second scene where we see Hatem. He's walking down a dark street, and then he comes across this police officer who's doing his patrols, and he asks for a street, which the police officer does not know. And then he touches this police officer, his shoulders, his hands, and then tells him that he likes to make people very happy. Up to here, it doesn't make sense what "I like to make people happy" means until he offers this police officer some money, and then he walks away. The third scene in which we meet Hatem, it is within a restaurant where he's having a meal with Abd, the police officer. It's only later that the camera looks through the room and we see that this room or this restaurant only has men. It's a gay restaurant, a gay bar. So as they eat, Hatem uses very ambiguous language to describe his feelings. And at one time, he says to Abd, once you've had 2 or 3 more drinks, you'll find that you want to do delicious things, the most delicious things in life. It is not entirely clear what these delicious things Hatem is referring to are. But the choice of words undoubtedly leaves Abd feeling very uncomfortable. Hatem is seated very close to Abd and stares squarely into his eyes as they drink and eat. It soon dawns on Abd that the delicious things that Hatem is referring to is in fact sex. So they continue to eat, and sensing the very awkward situation, Abd says that he cannot do any delicious things at that time because his wife lives in a different city. And to this, Hatem replies, "Must you always do it with your wife? Most women aren't that nice at all." Abd is evidently shocked as his body language immediately changes and his facial expression reflects utter disbelief. Hatem seems not to read this change in Abd's body language, and instead of moving away, he moves even closer and begins to caress Abd's thighs and crouch. Abd immediately tells Hatem to remove his hands from his body, to which Hatem begs him to act casually, as this would give them unnecessary attention. But Abd does not take this into account. He kicks the table and the chair where they were sitting, and he marches out of the bar. He tells Hatem, or he evokes Islam and tells him that what they're doing is very wrong according to the Islamic religion. He says, "Heaven and earth shake because of this." And in another scene, he says the same thing about the way in which non-normative sexuality is against Islam. "Everything that I do with you is wrong. Liquor, day and night, sex, I've even quit praying." However, once they reach Hatem's apartment, the two continue to drink wine, and it seems as they drink wine, Abd becomes more free, or he allows Hatem to touch him however he wanted. Once they've drunk several bottles of wine, Hatem leaves the room and goes to his bedroom and lays on his belly. Abd follows, and we see the camera looking at Abd as he undresses and climbs on top of Hatem. However, the scene is cut short as it is replaced by a black screen. The intimacy between the two men is not shown on the screen. It is simply insinuated and suggested. The film suggests, by the way in which Hatem lays on his tummy, that he is the passive person in this sexual relation. And this in itself is a contradiction, because based on the fact that he had lots of money, he had the social capital and the social power. But at the same time, in the sexual act, he, if I can use the words of Leo Bessani, he abdicates his power because he allows Abd to penetrate him. So the last scene in which we see Hatem, he has found a new lover, and again they drink and they move to the bedroom. And this time, as the film, or as the camera focuses on the new young man, again undressing and getting ready for their action, we see that the young man holds his belt and then uses that belt to strangle Hatem to death. So this death towards the very end of the film is very symbolic. Having found a new young man, he takes him to his apartment and the two have wine as he normally does with the young man that he chooses. So the young man at the end rainsacks Hatem's apartment, and the camera zooms in on Hatem's motionless body. There seems to be some sort of poetic justice for a man who has ambivalently negotiated his sexuality, which is either looked down upon or isn't recognized at all. Hatem's death, as Stephen Murray in 2013 explains, conforms to the injunction, "The homosexual must die," that ruled Anglophone movies and was common in books as well during the 1950s and 60s. Suicide and murder were the alternatives for such characters. So I'll move on now to the films from sub-Saharan Africa. And the first of these is I Am Samuel, which was directed by Peter Moremi from Kenya. I Am Samuel tells the story of a young man named Samuel who is torn between the desire to make his parents proud by having a family of his own. At the same time, he falls in love with a man called Alex, and he establishes a family and community with queer friends in Nairobi. The film moves between the countryside and the city, Nairobi, as Samuel negotiates his relationship with his parents on one side and with his lover on the other. And the film uses the trope of rural-urban and urban-rural mobility to stage Samuel's journey towards self-discovery, self-acceptance, and more importantly, acceptance by his parents. The idea of tracing queer bodies in rural settings is one element that makes I Am Samuel stand out from other queer films from sub-Saharan Africa. I Am Samuel offers a representation of a subtle form of transgression. So in the opening scene of the film, we see Samuel and Alex in a park. They share a very intimate moment together. They hold hands lovingly as they move around this park. This initial scene is followed immediately after by a scene in which we see a man who's presumed to be gay being stripped and being beaten up by a mob. The hands of this man are adorned with colorful jewelry and his fingers are painted with bright red nail polish. The young men who assault him say different homophobic words. For example, one man says, "You make us look bad," whilst another asks, "Are you a woman? Why are you wearing a bra?" And yet another asks, "He needs to get circumcised. Bring me a knife." So these first two scenes are very important, especially when they are read against each other. The violence that is meted out on the queer body of the man is also the same violence that Samuel and his partner have to negotiate on a daily basis when they live in Nairobi. So from the very beginning of the film, it is very clear that Samuel has a very close relationship with his parents, who live in the rural areas and are simple subsistence farmers, who expect him to get married and to bring a wife to help them out in the homestead, as they are old and unable to do all these household chores themselves. In one scene, his father states, "I want him to get a wife. If he gets a wife, everything will be good." So Samuel finds in Nairobi a new form of kinship and belonging where his body is not considered as deviant or as incorrect. He recounts how growing up in his rural home, he came to understand that he had feelings that were different and that the desires of his body were not what was recommended by his culture or by his parents' religion. He states, and I quote him, "When I discovered who I was, it was so hard to find myself, to find someone like me here. But then I met a friend when I came to Nairobi and discovered the internet. That's when I found out that there are many people like me." What I found very interesting about this film is the way in which there's an intersection between queerness and space making. So normally it would be considered that the rural space would be unwelcoming of queer bodies, and that the urban space, on the contrary, would be one where queer bodies would find their place. However, in this film, we see that the main character is able to negotiate his queerness even within the very traditional and very religious space of the rural area. And I found one scene, especially towards the end of this film, very telling of the way in which it's possible to change even the most traditional of societies. So in this scene, the protagonist has had a fallout with his parents, and they've told him that he's no longer their son, and for 8 months he does not communicate with them, and he does not return to the rural areas. So he receives a phone call from his mom, who tells him to come and visit them. So he goes back to the rural areas to visit them together with his partner, Alex. So what's really striking about the scene that I want to look at is the way in which Alex is integrated into the prayers of the family. So the main protagonist explains that every prayer in our home starts by calling out everyone's names. Today, a new name was added in our prayers. That name is Alex. So the inclusion of Alex in the very important family ritual of prayer speaks to a change in the ways in which Samuel's parents consider their son. They cannot verbally tell Samuel that they accept him for who he is and for what he is, because their religious and cultural beliefs would not let them to do so. But through diverse non-verbal cues, they can express to their son the way in which they consent to his life and also his lifestyle. It is interesting that prayer, which brings Samuel closer to his parents, also becomes a site of transgression. So prayer allows them to forge both corporeal and affective solidarities. The transgression of religion and cultural ideals takes place not from outside the cultures or from outside the religion, but from within the cultures and the religions themselves. The change of heart in Samuel's parents happens even in the moment of practicing their own religious and cultural rituals. The film ends in this very hopeful tone in which Samuel's body and that of his partner find acceptance in the conservative rule space. If Alex's name has been invited into the sacred space of the familial prayers, the film suggests that there is a possibility that his body as well will be invited to take its rightful place in the house that Samuel's father had built for his son and his future partner. I'll quickly then move on to the last film, which is from South Africa, and it's called The World Unseen, directed by Shamim Sarif. And the film was released in 2007. The film is set in South Africa in the 1950s, and it is during the period that the apartheid system is being introduced and enforced in South Africa. So it focuses on two Indian South African women, Amina and Miriam, who fall in love within a very sexist, racist, and homophobic society. Amina, the one who's down over here, is a single, carefree, and independent woman who runs her own cafe and restaurant. Miriam, on the other hand, is married and appears to subscribe to what is expected of her as a daughter, as a wife, and also as a mother. Amina and Miriam negotiate their relationship within an Indian sociocultural space that expects women to behave in particular ways. Moreover, they also have to contend with the new apartheid laws, which not only made it illegal for different races to intermingle, but also prohibited non-normative gender and sexual identities. Although Miriam conforms to societal expectations, the film suggests that she's not happy in her marriage. And the introduction of the queer character in this film, Amina, is important in allowing her to question her own ideas about herself as a woman and also her place in the society that she lives in. So Amina is queered from the very beginning of the film. For example, it is suggested that she's not a real Indian because she has black blood in her, since, as it's explained, Amina's grandmother had been raped by a black man. Amina is therefore treated as an outcast because of this element in her history. In many ways, then, Amina embodies the two main threats at that time to white supremacy: blackness and queerness. So Amina and the queer relationship that she has with Miriam becomes an agent provocateur that initiates the different forms of defiance that this film articulates. She is framed as gender non-conforming, as seen by the way in which she dresses, and also the way in which she's a strong woman who runs her own business. So although Amina and Miriam have different temperaments, they both have to negotiate their identities in a South African space in which whiteness reigns supreme. Within the apartheid system, the intersection between race and gender was particularly manifest for women of non-white races, since they had to undergo a double form of inferiorization. They were made inferior to begin with by the fact racially because they were non-white, and also at the level of their gender, in that within patriarchal societies they occupied positions below those of men. So the film, through looking at the relationship between the two women, tracks the way in which Miriam travels towards self-discovery and self-affirmation. So the film ends on a very, sorry, so it's well worth pointing out that one of the ways in which this film looks at transgression by the two women, especially Miriam, is in the way in which she learns how to drive, and how learning how to drive opens new opportunities for her, in that she finds a job and is able to look after herself and not necessarily live or stay at home and look after her children. So through her interactions with Amina, Miriam learns that she has to think of herself as an individual and not simply as an object that serves at the pleasure of her husband. Through the two women, this film shows that the intimacy between women is a way of challenging patriarchal Indian societies in South Africa, as well as the oppressive and bigoted apartheid system. Let me point out in conclusion that in thinking of the subtle changes and the continuities and the discontinuities that have taken place in how queerness is represented in African films, I was very interested in the ways in which these different depictions converse with one another across spaces, across cultures, and also across times. Such conversations are pivotal in developing not just archives of queerness, but more importantly, genealogies of queerness on the continent. Creating genealogies of kinship requires the different films that I've analyzed in this project to imagine queerness differently, otherwise, and to bring into friction or into conversation the representations from different parts of the continent. The dialogue and the friction that I speak about is important in initiating or creating visual archives of African queerness, and the growing body of queer-themed films interrogates colonial and heteropatriarchal archives whose invocation of African queerness is based on binary epistemologies of hetero, homo, correct, incorrect, clean, and unclean. More importantly, by shifting focus onto pleasures and desires, modern-day African queer films are involved in a decolonial project that sets to recover African sexualities from the vilification that was instituted by colonialism. Brenna Monroe rightly points out, and I quote her in conclusion, that thinking, imagining, and creating queer African pleasure itself then enacts a form of decolonization. I thank you.
Thank you, Gibson, for not only introducing us to these 4 films, which I think is new to most of us, also raising our interest in the other films that you will are treating in your manuscript, and also the sensitive way in which you embed them within the study of queer studies in your field of discipline. So we'll open the floor to questions, comments from here. We can also take comments online in the form of written posts. So for those online, please type your questions and comments, and we'll pick them up here. And I'll repeat your question, and then Gibson can respond. So let's open the floor here for the start.
That was dramatic. It was such a lovely presentation, and there was so much in it. And one of the things I was wondering about is access to queer film across the continent, because I've not heard of any of these films before, and I feel like I have reasonably good media access. And just thinking about young people across the continent grappling with their sexuality, and how easy is it for people to get hold of this genre of cinema to begin with, never mind the 4 films that you highlighted. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jess, for that question, which is a very important question because access to queer-themed films is very, very difficult in Africa. And most of these films, I think, the majority of the films that I analyze are mostly produced for festivals. So for queer film festivals and other types of festivals. And you would not readily see these, for example, in your normal theater, or they being available on different platforms like Netflix. So access isn't very good, and one would need to know someone who knows someone who's got a copy, a physical copy, for example, for you to be able to watch some of these films, which is what I had to do to get access to most of these films. I'd need to ask friends in North Africa, for example, if they had copies of these films, because online it's impossible to get them.
I've got a follow-up question on this. Were these films shown in the original countries, i.e. in Morocco, in Egypt, probably in South Africa, but were these films shown in other African countries, like in Uganda, where I think being queer or homosexual is very difficult, to say the least?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think of the 4 films that I analyzed, only the South African film was not banned in its original country. So, for example, Lamidou Salou was shown once in Morocco and then banned after that. And the Yakubian Building was not even shown at all. It was banned before it was shown in the cinema houses. So these films are not shown. And I think even in a very progressive country like South Africa, a queer film like Ncube, The Wound, I think, there was also serious problems when it was first released. There were very serious demonstrations by people who felt that that film was showing the Xhosa culture in a very wrong light. And the film as well was banned because it was considered close to hardcore porn, which is very funny because at the same time, the 50 Shades of Grey was showing in the cinemas, and that was showing, and there was no problem with that.
Okay, thank you, Gibson, for your wonderful presentation. My contribution or question is a follow-up to your response to the last question. Since you note that these films were banned in their respective countries, mm-hmm. where they were filmed or they were produced, and from your analysis of the film, the 4 films, would you say that the banning of the films is consistent with what they show or what is portrayed in the films? And related to that, the last question would be, what, from your reading of the situation of these novels, what do you see as the trajectory of queerness, queer bodies, and thank you, in Africa?
Thank you very much. I'll start with the last one in terms of the trajectory. So you do get a sense that there are more and more films that are being produced, but at the same time, they're not being watched or engaged with by people on the African continent. So they are watched mostly in the global north. Okay. And if I understood well your first question on the banning of the film and what they represent.
Yeah, the sort of the reactions which are shown by the society in those films towards parents.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, is there any link or relationship which you see from those two? The responses from
Mhm.
the state regulatory authorities and what you see happen in the society as portrayed in the films.
Yeah. So one part of what I did in this book project was to look at the reactions to the films. So for example, looking at online reactions to simple things like a review of a film, and then just looking at the kinds of dialogues that take place in the comment sections. So you'll find that you have two very diametrically opposed and very polarized ways of considering queerness. So you have on one side people who think that it's an African and that it's wrong, and that it's also wrong to produce films that represent such forms of sexualities. And then on the other hand, you have viewers who feel that these films are doing something very important in making visible queer lived experiences on the African continent. So you have these very two polarized ways of considering queerness in Africa.
Hi, thank you so much for that. Walked in a bit late, had other kind of engagements. But thank you so much for the care with which you looked at the films. And so I'll speak to particularly the last two, which is the bit that I got. And the one aspect maybe you could talk about is the dichotomy between rural and urban, and I mean, to a degree, I feel like that's quite under-theorized, right? That there's this idea that the rural, as you were saying, is bad, and the city is good, right? And particularly in South Africa, the evidence in terms of violence in peri-urban areas, messes with this idea of city good, rural bad. And so if we could speak a little bit about that. But also linked to that is, you say, something about silence, and you talk about, the nonverbal communication, lack of a better term, that is happening. And I think this is another area that is quite under-theorized, in that silence is read as closet, right, in many ways, and silence is read as these kind of, again, another dichotomy where it's either you're in or out, which is in itself, right, is a kind of, a particular kind of epistemology, right, to think about sexuality being in or out, which is not necessarily from a kind of, African articulation of what, what bodies do and what bodies don't do. And then the last point is about you're gesturing towards a kind of pan-African queerness almost, right? In the way in which you are, looking at these films and looking at synergies, if you want, between what is taking place in different places across the continent. Thanks.
I'll try and go through your questions. The first, which is the rural-urban dichotomy, and I think the films that I analyze complicate this idea that the city is where queer bodies can be out and be themselves. Queer bodies can also be out in the role spaces, the very traditional, the very religious, the very traditional spaces. So the films that I look at push us to think beyond this rural-urban dichotomy and to complicate the idea that even within the city spaces, queer bodies, although out, are not really safe. They have to negotiate on a daily basis different forms of violence, be it verbal or even physical. And the idea of silence, so I think this was one of the main interventions that I wanted to make in this project, because after looking at a few films at the beginning of this project, I found that there was lots of silence of the queer bodies themselves, and also silence around the queer bodies as well. So I asked myself, then how do we make sense of these very real lived experiences if there's so much silence? Which is why I focused on the bodies. The body itself can be the site of creating knowledge, of making known and knowing queer lived experiences. So although there's silence around queer bodies, the queer bodies themselves can be read. So through semiotics, it's possible to decode different signs and symbols in the way that bodies act and perform identities and sexualities. And then in the last question about a Pan-African queerness, I think that was one of the objectives of the study, to look beyond the exceptionalism of South Africa and its progressive constitution. So I sought to look at what happens outside of South Africa, because there's a lot that is happening in terms of filmic representation. So most studies have focused on this very robust body of films from South Africa, and little has been said for most of these other films that I looked at. So what I wanted to do was to bring into dialogue South Africa's exceptionalism on one hand, and these other areas of the continent that have received very little or no form of academic engagement.
Thanks for that question. So Salim, and then we'll come to two questions in the front. It's for the audience.
So, thanks for a really stimulating presentation, Gibson. I want to push you on three issues, three observations. Firstly, the colonial and the decolonial.
Mm-hmm.
So the very example you give of a section of the Xhosa community protesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you see homophobia or being anti-gay as an entirely colonially invented tradition amongst indigenous people then? So what is the decolonial? Right? I think this is a really critical question then. Because if it's not simply a product, another invented tradition, if you like, right? Where do indigenous communities stand on this issue? And then what constitutes the decolonial? Is the decolonial everything else but not about gay issues? Right? That's the first issue. The second issue is, I'm curious because not only is Amina black, not only is Amina Indian, Amina is also Muslim. And that you don't pick up on that issue. Because in mainstream Islam, being gay is an incredible transgression. So there's that dimension that has to come in also. And thirdly, it might just have been an eliding here, but at one point you describe her as black. But subsequently, on 2 occasions, you use the word non-white. I'm curious about that too. Why black in a certain moment, and then the use of non-white at another moment? Because the linguistic issue is about colonial and decolonial too.
Mhm. Thank you very much, Salim, for those questions. So the first one on the colonial, decolonial. I think, let me start with the fact that like current presidents consider queerness to be un-African, but what is un-African is homophobia. This is what colonialism brought. Colonialism did not bring queer expressions of gender or sexuality. These existed before the arrival of the Europeans in Africa. So what colonialism brought was Christianity and judging these non-normative forms of gender and sexual expressions as wrong. So for me, what's important is to go back to this original site of queering of African lived experiences. And so the decolonial, in this case, means accepting that these lived experiences are African and did exist in Africa. So, for example, the Xhosa people who demonstrated against the film in labor being un-African were a bit wrong, I think, because these are things that have happened in African societies and which, even if people demonstrate, cannot be brushed aside. So these are very African lived experiences, and the decolonial turn, I think, would be to return to these forms of non-normative expressions of gender and identity, not necessarily using Western epistemologies or Western terms like queer to think through or to analyze these lived experiences, but to understand them within local contexts. And then, yes, the question of Islam is one that's very important, and I do this in the bigger project, comparing this film to the North African films, where you have Islam controlling almost all the parts of people's existences. But what I found interesting whilst doing this project is that Islam, compared to Christianity, was more permitting to queer lived experiences. Queer bodies were allowed to do whatever they want as long as it was in private, which is unlike in the Christian parts of the continent, where even in the private spaces, queerness cannot be practiced, it's wrong. And the last question on the black, non-white. So I used non-white when I spoke of Amina and Miriam together, because Miriam was not black. Well, for me, Indian was not black. Because the way in which Amina, for example, is treated is completely different from how Miriam is treated by the police when they come asking for the passes, for example.
Thanks, Salim. We have more questions in the room, but I'm going to read three related questions which we received from the audience online. Thank you. And then we'll come back to the questions in the room. They're all around the matter of queer bodies. So I'll read them to you, Gibson, and you can reply to all three simultaneously. The first, from an anonymous participant, says, how is queer bodies conceptualize and its difference from the queer? And then second, it would seem that queer bodies in the films you examined are either violated or silenced. Are there films where the queer bodies are treated kindly, humanely? All right, and then the third question is from David Moore, who was a fellow in 2019 as well. He says, thanks for the excellent paper and greetings. Given what often seem to you to be bodies as silences on film, do you see a distinct difference in books' take on queerness? Do you think there is a difference in this respect between, quote, the life of the mind in books, one might say, and, quote, the life of the body on film, which is noisier and has a much different way of making noise? So, thanks for those.
Thank you for those questions. I'll try and answer two. On whether there's kind representation of queer bodies, generally not in the films that I analyzed. So the bodies face violence, different forms of violence, but even within this violence, the bodies are able to forge communities amongst themselves and find some form of kindness that is shared among the queer bodies. But in the interaction between the queer and the non-queer bodies, it was mostly violent. Yeah. And on whether there's a difference between books and films, some of the films that I examined, for example, L'Ame du Salut was originally a book, which was also banned in Morocco. I think the films do something more than that, more than what books can offer. I think the visuality of the queer bodies pushes further than what mere descriptions with words can achieve. So I think the films have done more than what books could do, I think. For example, if you look at a film like Ncube and the way it talks about Isikxhosa rituals, Nelson Mandela had spoken about this in his long walk to freedom. Nothing was said, or there were no demonstrations about the way he spoke about this so-called secret world of men that is on the mountains. But once you have a film that represents and shows real bodies on screen being queer, then the transgression is more than with just mere words, I think.
Okay, thanks. So we have a question at the front here.
Gibson, it's great to have you back in Stellenbosch as a colleague in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. My question relates to the Egyptian film, the Yakubian Building. You made a remark there about penetration, and you referred to Leo Bersani, stating that there is an element of abdication of power by those who are, by the person who is penetrated. Do you think that's always the case? What about the phenomenon of the so-called power bottom? Could you maybe talk about that for a moment?
Thank you very much for that question. And I think what that film does is also complicate the idea that, especially in North Africa, that one is not queer in terms of the identity, but that one does queerness. So queerness is reduced to doing and not being. So what you have are just two bodies doing something to each other and nothing more than that. And in North Africa, there's scorn on the person who is penetrated, whilst the one who penetrates continues to to exercise their masculinity and enjoy everything that comes with being a man. So I think the films do, well, I don't think they do portray the power bottom, but what they do is to show that it's possible to think of queerness beyond just doing, and that it's possible to be queer. Yeah.
Thanks. Njoki.
Thanks, Gibson, for your work. So I have two questions. One, first, this is very important work, I think, for that queer archive and creating new imaginaries for African sexualities. But I'm also wondering theoretically, because if we're going to speak about decolonizing and this being a decolonial project, what does it mean? What does your work mean, all the films? That analysis, what does it mean in terms of theory? What theory is it creating, and how does it speak to Western theories that have been created on queer bodies? And so how is your work? What would be towards an African queer theory, a body of queer theory? What does it, and how does it speak to theories generated by Western scholarship, either on African bodies or on queer theory generally? So one. Secondly, what films did you only mention 4, and thank you. I had not watched them or known about them, but which others have you looked at in the greater project, and what themes emerge beyond, I mean, as you talk about theories also, but what themes emerge? You keep talking about silence. I believe that's one of the main issues that is coming out. And then speaking back to theory and an African theory, methodologically, again, what methodology, if we are going to again to a decolonial space, can this speak to, that you can say this is brought by African queer African film, and what theories can this your work bring that could also speak back to Western theory and Western methodologies of studying queer bodies?
Thank you very much for those interesting questions. So what I do in the bigger project is to begin by looking at the term queer itself and its use, and that although I use the term queer in my work, I'm cognizant that one cannot impose a very Western epistemology to try and understand non-Western lived experiences. So I'm very aware of the need to use the term queer, and I use it normally with quotes, because not all bodies that do non-heteronormative stuff are queer in Africa. So, for example, I find interesting, what's her name? But there's a scholar from West Africa who says that instead of using queer, uses the term to know. So you have knowing, well, women knowing each other instead of women being queer. So I think it's always important to come back to context and then build theories of these lived experiences from the specific contexts that are being examined, instead of imposing Michel Foucault and all the Western theorists to try and understand something that is not at all Western. And on which other films I analyzed in the study, there's quite a lot. So for example, from North Africa, I also looked at a film called Bedouin Hacker. There's also a film called Buried Secrets. And from East Africa, I looked at a film called Rafiki from Kenya and The Pearl of Africa from Uganda, which looks at trans bodies. And from South Africa, I looked at the Weldon scene in Ncube, and then 3 Afrikaans films, Morphe, Schoonheid, and what's the third one? Canary, yeah. Thank you. And yeah, the emerging themes obviously depend on the different region of Africa. So for example, from North Africa, that section I call silent and silenced bodies. And then from Egypt, which I found a bit different from the Maghreb, I called that section ambivalent bodies. And then from East Africa, transgressive bodies. And then the last section on South Africa was on intersectional bodies, because what was happening in South Africa was an intersection of many things, of class, of race, and privilege, and how all those shape the way we understand genders and sexualities.
Thanks for that question, Joki. Any others from the room here? So I have one more question from our online participants, anonymous, who says, I also have a question about the portrayal of queerness in films as opposed to books. Do you think films can, quote, get away with more in terms of suggesting queerness without having to depict it explicitly, whereas in books the queerness needs to be described more clearly?
I would think in Africa, books can get away more because there isn't a big reading culture in Africa. And, sorry, so it's possible to get away with more descriptions, more transgressive descriptions in books than in films. And in terms of films, I think films circulate faster today, especially because of piracy, for example. It's easier to share pirated films, and those circulate way faster than is the case with books. So I think books would get away with more transgressive descriptions than films.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of a wonderful conversation. Thank you for those questions and comments and inputs, and I agree with Njoki about the importance of this work in terms of the archive and the formation of a body of theory, Gibson. So good luck with the finalization of the manuscript, and we really do look forward to the book's publication. We'll have to organize a book launch event, I hope so, and look forward to following the rest of your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.